Please welcome Petra Nemcova, supermodel, philanthropist, co-founder of All Hands and Hearts, Smart Response, disaster risk reduction champion, and tsunami awareness advocate appointed by UNI SDR. Howard Sherman, CEO of Good 360, and Frank Giustra, CEO, Fiore Group, founder, and president, Radcliffe Foundation.
Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you're very well and having a very inspiring day. It's an honor to be here today. So let's see. Whoop. All right. September 19, 2017 was the day when Hurricane Maria destroyed Dominica, small island nation in the Caribbean. 90% of infrastructure was damaged. Vanessa, single mom of 4, brought her children to the workshop under the house to try to protect them from a hurricane. She had to chain her arm into the door to keep the door shut so the hurricane wouldn't suck out her young children from the building. At some point she screamed, "I can't hold it anymore." And her older daughter took a wire, put it around her arm, connected it to the door, and both held the door. Thankfully, they survived. She sent her children to Barbados to distant relatives for 10 months, hoping that she can pick up the pieces and rebuild her home and a workshop, which was her livelihood. 1 year later, today, she has received no help, and she has to go live in a tent. This is not a random story. This is a story of so many families, young families, elderly. And you may be asking, why is it happening when there's so much outpour of support right after natural disasters, of financial support, goods, volunteers? Well, my dear friend Frank Giustra, who is here with us, he will tell you a little bit what's happening with this support from a statistics standpoint. Frank?
Yeah, thanks, Petra. You know, my philanthropic journey really started during the 2004 tsunami. And like most people, I was emotionally overwhelmed, and I picked up the phone and I called one of these very large international aid organizations and donated a large check without asking any questions and no idea where the money was going, how it was going to be spent. In the 15 years since, I've learned a lot of valuable lessons because I've spent a lot of time actually hands-on on various philanthropic efforts. And the sad reality is that those donated goods that you talked about, 60% of them end up in landfills. There's lack of a coordination, and most of it goes to waste. The other sad reality is that because it's an emotional kind of giving, that 70% of the money comes in the first 2 months and then it trickles off to nothing. And only 5% of that money goes towards rebuilding their lives, their homes, which usually takes up to 5 years. So as admirable as that emotional giving is, it's not smart. And you know, I've learned that in all, not just in disaster relief, but in all other sorts of issues involving poverty and refugees and what have you. And this is why I'm so inspired by what you do, and All Hands and Hearts is a very smart way to address disaster relief.
Thank you, Frank. Well, I will share how amazing Frank is in a minute. But for now, Howard, what we can do about this problem?
Yeah, so what we're really talking about is a behavior change, right? We're talking about how do we influence, educate people so that when they give, because so many people do give out of great intentions, that they give in a way that actually has long-term, durable impact. And so, you know, I think everybody in this room has their own sphere of influence. My organization, Good 360, which is partnered with Petra's, our sphere of influence is around 2 things. We understand supply chain management, so that one of the problems that Frank talked about and challenges of 60% of product that's donated going to waste, our mission is to make sure that we can reduce that number to 0. The other sphere of influence that we have is that we work with 400 companies in managing their excess goods in a responsible way to keep those goods out of landfills. So much of those goods, and on an annualized basis, we move roughly $400 million worth of product. We're about to hit $9 billion in total of goods that are highly usable goods for disaster recovery, both short-term and long-term. And so what we do is we spend a lot of time with our corporate partners, educating them and encouraging them to think not just in terms of the news cycle, but in terms of the full 5-year recovery.
Thank you, Howard. So I wanted to ask Frank and Howard and myself as well, why does it matter? Why does it matter to each of us? Well, similar to Frank, for the last 13 years, I've been in this space post-natural disasters, working closely, disaster after disaster, year after year, seeing the same pattern happening. First responders come, they do very important work. Once they leave, families are forgotten, especially in the rural areas. And over the last few years, I hope that somebody will go and fix this pattern. But it was not happening. So that's why we got together with the Global Citizen and Good 360 to solve this issue, because individually we all were so frustrated with this pattern. Knowing that natural disasters are not going anywhere, they're increasing in frequency and strength, we have no more luxury to be just reactive. We have to be proactive, and we have to build resilience. Only when you focus only on first response, you cannot build resilience. And when you focus on long-term resilient thinking, that's when you, number one, can get families back on their feet faster, and you build in resilience for building with the right building codes. And that will help them to be protected from future natural disasters. This is why I am so passionate about it, and that's why we launched a Resilient Response Initiative just last week to gather everybody together to solve this glitch in the system. Now, Frank, why is it important to you as a philanthropist, as a business leader, as a father? Why is it important for you to think long-term?
It's just been through experience. You know, we went to Puerto Rico together. It was 3 months after Hurricane Maria. It had been off the headlines for a little bit, and really nothing had changed. And you can see that as soon as it's off the headlines, as soon as people stop talking about it, it's forgotten. People get on with their daily lives. And, I think as most things, I look at most of what I do in philanthropy, I always think about my own kids. I always think, how would you feel as a parent if your children were subjected to a natural disasters like a hurricane or other issues that I'm involved in, and nobody cares, and there's nobody there? And I also look at things like a businessman, and I think that, again, people give out of emotion, but you have to, if you really want to fix a problem, you have to look at it almost like you would look at any business endeavor. From a logical point of view, how do you get the job done so people don't suffer? And I know it's not as sexy as, the initial, outpouring of generosity, but it is the sad reality that someone has to do it. And so, again, I think that's one of the biggest reasons that I came on board with All Hands and Hearts, was because of your very logical business approach to getting the job done.
And Frank is really walking the walk. Right after Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, gave a $400,000 donation, and for the first anniversary of Hurricane Maria, gave a matching donation of $250,000, which was just launched 5 days ago, to help more families to get back to their homes, but also to raise awareness that we need to think about these families. We can't just forget about them. So thank you, Frank, for this. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, exactly. Howard, as a CEO of Good 360, you represent 400 companies. Why is it important for them to be part of a long-term resilient response? Why is it important for them, for their customers, for their employees?
Yeah, I think, we're living in a world where there's a lot more accountability, clearly, not just in terms of corporate leadership, but a lot more accountability that's expected from the associates and employees of those companies, as well as their customers. When you think about natural disasters, the companies we work with are some of the largest companies in the world. These events are happening within their business footprint. So they do have a self-interest from a business point of view to help stimulate durable recovery. And I think that motivation is absolutely a legitimate motivation. but it needs to be coupled with giving that makes sense, right? And for me personally, at the end of the day, like Frank, this is about lives. You spend time in a disaster site 12 months later, and it's the most vulnerable communities that are truly living in situations that are just horrific. And so from a corporate point of view, I think corporations have a responsibility, and I think their employees and their customers need to hold corporations accountable for that responsibility. And it's not just about a press release saying we're doing good things. It's about thinking through how do you actually do good things. And the press release is kind of the peripheral.
Thank you, Howard. So what is resilient response? It's a pledge, a very simple pledge of 6 points, actually very much a common sense, which unfortunately common sense is not very common when it comes to natural disasters. And we launched it last week and already had amazing support of many companies from Airbnb and Salesforce.org to TUMI, to UPS and CVS. And actually, a few days ago, American Eagle joined, but also gave a donation for long-term resilient response. We got amazing donation as well of $1 million for long-term response. So my call to action to each of you here, if you're individual representing foundation or corporation, join us in thinking long-term, because only when we think long-term, we can get families faster on their feet, and we can build in resilience. And that's crucial, because natural disasters are not going anywhere, and the next disaster, it can happen right here. So that's the call to action, and let us know if you have any questions.
Hi, my name is Jamie Grodsky, and I work for a global nonprofit. And I think it's very interesting to see what happens after natural disasters, and it does seem that they're increasing in number and frequency. Do you tend to find that big telethons and big, I want to say PR and marketing efforts early on help in, in response to these disasters, or do you think that they're doing them a disservice long term?
If you want to answer as well, I think definitely they are crucial. They are doing they serve a very important job. I would just what I would change about when the funds are raised at that moment when everybody's emotional and there's emotional giving, that the money raised is distributed over several years, because it takes 5 years on average, and if the money is spent only for first response, it's not going to create that resilience. So it's very good, because that's when you have all the spotlight on that particular disaster, but the distribution of the funds needs to be smarter and thinking long term. So that's about the organizers. They have to think it through in a more thoughtful and smarter way.
No, the only other thing I would say is I do think that, in addition to things like telethons or events associated with disasters, I think the media also has a very large responsibility to reporting on disasters in a thoughtful way, and making sure that, there tends to be a focus on everything that goes wrong, and God only knows there's an awful lot that goes wrong in terms of disaster response. But I think the media has a great opportunity to help people, whether it's individuals or corporations, be mindful of the long tail of what recovery looks like and what that means in terms of people's giving, again, whether it comes from corporations or from individuals.
And perhaps everyone who gets involved at the beginning, if it's individual corporation, make a long-term commitment to that country, to that region, to those families, and check in with them, how they are doing, 1 year later, how they are doing 2 years later, because we don't do that. We give and move on to the next thing. But I think each of us, we can make this commitment to checking what is really happening, because it's not going to be in the news probably. So making that personal commitment to ourselves and those communities to check in with them. Please.
I think that's a great point, and it strikes me that because all that money is needed up front as well, it's not just about redistributing the money from the beginning to the longer tail, but increasing the amount of money overall. My question to the point that you just raised is how do you create that longer term commitment, whether it's from individuals or corporations?
So it's just commitment to yourself first, to just literally like, okay, I'm going to keep checking on this community, see how they are doing. And as a corporation, many corporations, what they do, they have a pressure from their employees and their customers to make some kind of commitment right within the next 2-3 days of a disaster. And they usually give very generously, but in a bit rushed way. So if they are donating $500,000, what I would suggest to say, okay, we're going to give, let's say, 50% for first response, and that 50% goes to rebuilding, if it's homes or schools or some kind of long-term rebuilding which needs to be done. And it will take time to find out what's the true need on the ground, not just rush it. Because at day 2 or 3, you don't know what's the true need in 6 months' time. So make that commitment as a corporation, but make it for both first response and rebuilding. That way you can help the families the best possible way. And I've been so passionate about this, because when we can change this behavior, which is the hardest thing to change, this will help so many families to have less suffering. And instead of them waiting for 4 years to have a home, they may be waiting for 1 year. That matters to those families. And there's so much unnecessary suffering just because of the way we think short term instead of long term. So the time will run out, but I urge you, on behalf of the families who have been impacted by the recent natural disasters, and on behalf of families who will be impacted by future natural disasters, just by changing the way we react with long-term thinking, we will be able to make a huge difference and alleviate lots of unnecessary suffering. It's actually quite simple, yet it takes time to implement. So thank you for spreading the word out as well to your colleagues, to your friends and family, because just that different distribution of funding and support will make a humongous shift and a necessary shift in disaster giving. Thank you so much.
Good job.
This concludes this section. Please head downstairs to the Action Village.